A quiet person can carry years of pain without ever raising their voice. That is the part most people never understand about empaths. People often mistake their silence for weakness, their patience for emotional dependence, and their forgiveness for lack of self-respect. But the truth is far more dangerous than that. Empaths are not weak people who cannot leave. They are people who continue loving long after others would have already walked away. They keep trying to understand behavior that keeps hurting them. They keep making excuses for disrespect because they focus on wounds instead of warning signs. And that is exactly why so many people fail to notice the moment everything changes inside them. Because when an empath finally reaches their limit, there is rarely a loud argument, rarely revenge, rarely chaos. Instead, there is silence, cold distance, emotional disappearance. One day they stop explaining. They stop defending the relationship. They stop asking to be understood. And the scariest part is that most people never even realize which moment caused it. They continue thinking the empath will forgive again like they always did before. But this time is different. This time something inside them has permanently closed. And by the time the other person notices the emotional connection fading away, the empath has already spent weeks, months, or even years grieving the relationship in silence. That hidden emotional process is what makes empath breakups so misunderstood. Because empaths do not suddenly stop caring overnight. Their love dies slowly, quietly, in private, long before they physically leave. Across psychology discussions and emotional behavior studies, one pattern continues appearing again and again. People with high emotional sensitivity often tolerate unhealthy treatment longer than emotionally detached people, not because they enjoy suffering, not because they are naive, but because their minds constantly search for emotional explanations behind behavior. They notice pain in others quickly. They understand trauma quickly. They can sense guilt, insecurity, loneliness, and emotional damage hiding underneath someone's actions. And while this ability makes them deeply compassionate, it also becomes the exact reason they stay too long in situations that slowly destroy them. An empath can recognize toxic behavior while still feeling sympathy for the person causing it. That emotional contradiction becomes exhausting. Because while everyone else sees obvious disrespect, the empath keeps focusing on the possibility of change. They keep remembering the good moments. They keep hoping the connection can return to what it once was. And little by little, they begin sacrificing their own emotional stability just to keep peace in the relationship alive. Many people think empaths leave because they become cold or heartless. But the reality is almost the opposite. Empaths usually leave because they cared too much for too long, without receiving emotional safety in return. There is a dangerous point where understanding turns into self-destruction. A point where forgiveness becomes emotional self-neglect. Most empaths never notice when they cross that line because their focus stays locked on saving the relationship instead of protecting themselves. They become emotional caretakers. They absorb tension, they calm arguments. They excuse disrespect. They carry emotional responsibility for everyone around them while silently ignoring their own emotional exhaustion. And eventually the pressure becomes too heavy even for them. This is where the real story begins, because the final breaking point of an empath is rarely caused by one single mistake. It is usually caused by a painful realization, a realization that changes the entire way they see the relationship, a realization that the pain was not accidental anymore. That the disrespect continued even after clear communication, that their kindness became expected instead of appreciated, that their forgiveness became permission, and once that realization settles into their mind, something shifts permanently. The emotional connection begins shutting down from the inside, slowly at first, almost invisible. They speak less, they react less, they stop opening up emotionally. Their energy changes, their warmth fades. And the people around them often fail to recognize these signs because they became too comfortable receiving unconditional understanding without consequences. Tonight, we are going deep into the hidden psychology behind empath behavior and emotional detachment. This video is not just about why empaths forgive. It is about the exact emotional line that changes everything. The line most people never see coming. You are going to understand why empaths tolerate pain longer than most people, why they struggle to walk away even when they are deeply hurt, and why their final goodbye is often silent instead of dramatic. We are also going to uncover lesser-known psychological patterns connected to emotional exhaustion, repeated betrayal, trauma bonding, and silent emotional shutdowns that many people experience without even realizing it. Some of these behaviors are so subtle that relationships can begin emotionally collapsing months before anyone notices it happening. And once you understand these patterns, you will never look at quiet emotional distance the same way again. There is another side to this conversation that almost nobody talks about. The emotional memory of empaths is extremely deep. They remember how people made them feel more than the exact words that were spoken. This means emotional betrayal affects them differently than it affects most people. Harsh words can hurt them, but emotional inconsistency damages them even more. Broken trust stays inside their mind for a long time because they replay emotional moments repeatedly, trying to understand what changed. They study behavior patterns, tone changes, energy shifts, emotional absence. And while they may continue acting normal on the outside, internally they are slowly disconnecting piece by piece. Many empaths spend months emotionally grieving relationships while still physically present inside them. That hidden emotional grieving process explains why their final exit often feels sudden to everyone else. The other person thinks everything was normal because the empath stayed quiet, but internally the connection had already been dying for a very long time. Another fact that rarely gets discussed is that empaths are often highly conflict-avoidant people. They do not enjoy emotional chaos. They do not enjoy hurting others. Many of them would rather stay emotionally uncomfortable than risk causing pain to someone else. This creates dangerous relationship dynamics where the empath keeps suppressing their true feelings to maintain emotional peace. Over time, resentment builds silently underneath their patience. Not loud resentment, not aggressive resentment, quiet emotional fatigue. The kind that slowly drains emotional attachment until nothing is left. And once that emotional numbness arrives, it becomes incredibly difficult to reverse. Because by then, the empath no longer feels emotionally safe enough to reconnect the same way again. One of the biggest mistakes people make with empaths is assuming forgiveness means permanent tolerance. It does not. Forgiveness and trust are completely different things. An empath may forgive someone many times while secretly losing emotional trust after every betrayal. That hidden separation is important because most people only notice the forgiveness. They do not notice the emotional damage quietly accumulating underneath it. Every dismissed feeling, every broken promise, every moment of disrespect, every emotional manipulation. Every time their vulnerability was ignored, it all stays stored deep inside them, and eventually the emotional weight becomes too heavy to carry anymore. The most painful part is that empaths often blame themselves first. Before they stop trusting others, they usually stop trusting their own judgment. They question whether they are overreacting, whether they are expecting too much, whether they are being too emotional. And because of this constant self-questioning, they delay leaving situations that are slowly destroying their mental peace. Many empaths spend years trying to fix relationships that were emotionally damaging from the beginning. Not because they are blind, but because hope keeps overpowering reality. They believe love can heal unhealthy behavior. They believe understanding someone deeply enough will eventually make them change. But some people do not change when they receive kindness. Some people simply become more comfortable hurting the person who keeps forgiving them. That realization becomes the final emotional turning point. The moment the empath understands that their love is no longer being protected, that their emotional loyalty is being used instead of valued. And once that understanding becomes clear, the emotional shutdown begins. It is not dramatic. It is not loud, it is often invisible at first, but internally something irreversible starts happening. The person who once gave endless chances suddenly stops reaching out, stops explaining their feelings repeatedly, stops fighting for emotional connection alone. And eventually they stop caring whether the relationship survives at all. That emotional indifference is usually the final stage. Not anger, not hate, exhaustion. By the end of this video, you will fully understand why empath detachment feels so cold after years of warmth, why emotionally sensitive people disappear silently instead of loudly, and why the final emotional line has less to do with pain itself and more to do with betrayal of trust. You will also see why many people only recognize the value of an empath after the emotional connection is already gone forever. Because the truth is, empaths rarely leave at the beginning of the damage, they leave after surviving too much of it. So stay with me until the very end, because the deeper psychology behind empath boundaries, emotional exhaustion, and silent detachment becomes even more powerful as we continue. Some of the patterns we are about to uncover are painfully accurate for people who spent years loving others while slowly losing themselves in the process. And once you truly understand the emotional line that changes an empath forever, you will begin noticing signs and behaviors that most people completely miss. Welcome to the silent empath. If deep psychological truths, emotional intelligence, human behavior, and hidden relationship dynamics fascinate you, subscribe to the channel and become part of this journey, because sometimes the quietest people carry the deepest emotional stories. Most people think forgiveness is simple. Someone hurts you, apologizes, and eventually things return to normal. But for empaths, forgiveness is far more complicated than that. It is deeply emotional, deeply psychological, and sometimes even dangerous, because empaths do not just listen to words. They absorb emotions. They pay attention to pain hidden underneath behavior. They notice sadness behind anger, fear behind control, insecurity behind manipulation. While most people focus on actions, empaths focus on emotional causes. And that is exactly why they forgive people far longer than they should. Their mind naturally searches for understanding before judgment. When someone raises their voice, an empath does not immediately think, "This person is cruel." Instead, they wonder what pain created that behavior. When someone becomes distant, the empath often assumes they are emotionally struggling instead of intentionally neglectful. This emotional perspective makes them incredibly compassionate people, but it also places them in situations where they continue excusing behavior that slowly destroys their own peace. They become emotional translators for people who never learned how to communicate their pain properly. They try to decode emotional wounds hidden underneath harmful actions. And while that level of emotional sensitivity sounds beautiful on the surface, it quietly turns into emotional self-sacrifice over time. Empaths often grow up becoming emotionally aware far earlier than most people around them. They become experts at sensing tension before anyone speaks. They notice changes in tone, changes in energy, tiny emotional shifts others completely ignore. Because of this, many empaths spend their lives adapting emotionally to the needs of everyone around them. They become peacemakers, emotional caretakers, the person who calms everyone else down while silently carrying their own emotional exhaustion alone. And after years of doing this, they begin developing a dangerous habit. They start believing love means understanding people no matter how much pain it causes them personally. That belief becomes the reason they tolerate emotional neglect longer than they should. Because every time someone hurts them, their first instinct is not self-protection. It is emotional analysis. They ask themselves why the person acted that way. They search for explanations. They search for emotional wounds. They search for hidden suffering. And sometimes that compassion becomes so strong that they completely ignore the reality of what is happening to them. One of the most misunderstood things about empaths is that they rarely see themselves as victims. Even when they are being emotionally drained, manipulated, or neglected, they continue focusing on the struggles of the other person. That is why so many empaths remain loyal inside relationships that are quietly damaging them. They keep thinking things will improve once the other person heals, once life becomes less stressful, once communication gets better, once emotions calm down. They become attached to potential instead of reality. They remember the good moments more strongly than the painful ones. And because they emotionally bond very deeply, they do not detach easily. Their love is patient almost to a fault. They believe people deserve chances, then more chances, then even more chances after that. But every extra chance slowly costs them something internally. Another hidden truth is that empaths are often terrified of becoming emotionally hard. They fear losing their compassion. They fear becoming cold. So even when someone hurts them repeatedly, they continue choosing understanding because it feels morally safer than emotional distance. They tell themselves things like maybe the person did not mean it that way, maybe they are overwhelmed, maybe they are struggling internally, maybe they are fighting battles nobody sees. And sometimes those explanations are true, but empathy becomes dangerous when it starts replacing boundaries. Because understanding pain does not erase the damage caused by behavior. Someone can be hurting internally and still hurt others emotionally. Someone can have trauma and still become toxic. Someone can struggle mentally and still repeatedly disrespect people who love them. But empaths struggle to accept this reality because their emotional instincts constantly push them toward compassion first. This creates a painful psychological contradiction inside them. They feel hurt by someone's behavior while simultaneously feeling guilty for being hurt. They start questioning their own emotional reactions. They wonder if they are being too sensitive, too demanding, too emotional. Meanwhile, their nervous system is slowly becoming exhausted from carrying emotional stress they were never supposed to hold alone. Many empaths spend years emotionally overextending themselves trying to preserve relationships that only survive because of their constant emotional effort. They become the emotional glue holding unstable connections together. They communicate more, forgive more, understand more, sacrifice more, and eventually they become emotionally depleted without even realizing how empty they have become internally. One of the saddest parts about empath psychology is that they often attract emotionally unavailable or emotionally wounded people. Not because empaths enjoy suffering, but because wounded people feel safe around emotional understanding. The empath becomes a place where others unload their fears, insecurities, trauma, and emotional chaos. At first, this creates deep emotional bonding. The empath feels needed, valuable, connected. But over time, many of these relationships become emotionally unbalanced. The empath keeps giving emotional support while receiving less and less emotional care in return. Yet they continue staying because they remember how emotionally connected things felt in the beginning. They keep hoping the person will return to that version of themselves. They keep waiting for consistency, waiting for emotional maturity, waiting for reciprocity. And while they wait, their emotional energy slowly disappears. Empaths are also highly affected by emotional inconsistency. Warmth one day and distance the next creates intense internal confusion for them. Because they naturally seek emotional harmony, inconsistent behavior keeps them emotionally anxious. They overthink conversations, replay interactions, analyze silence, study tiny emotional changes. They try to fix problems before problems are even spoken out loud. And this constant emotional monitoring becomes mentally exhausting. Yet most people around them never realize how much emotional effort the empath is spending internally every single day just trying to maintain peace inside the relationship. There comes a point where the empath starts feeling emotionally responsible for everyone around them. If someone is upset, they feel pressure to fix it. If someone becomes distant, they assume they did something wrong. If someone behaves badly, they immediately search for emotional explanations instead of protecting themselves. Over time, this creates deep emotional burnout. Their own needs become invisible to them because they spend so much energy managing the emotional atmosphere around other people. Many empaths do not even realize how emotionally neglected they are until they reach complete exhaustion. They become so focused on understanding others that they stop understanding themselves. And the damage rarely happens loudly. That is what makes it so dangerous. Empaths do not suddenly collapse emotionally overnight. Their breaking point develops slowly beneath the surface. Quietly, invisibly, they continue smiling while emotionally draining themselves internally. They continue showing patience while feeling increasingly disconnected inside. They continue giving emotional support while silently wishing someone would finally notice their own pain too. But because they are usually the strong emotional supporter in relationships, people assume they are okay. People assume they can handle everything. People assume their forgiveness is endless, and eventually the empath begins feeling emotionally unseen in the very relationships they sacrifice the most for. One painful reality about empaths is that they often attract people who become dependent on their emotional tolerance. The more the empath forgives, the more certain people begin taking that forgiveness for granted. Boundaries slowly disappear. Respect slowly weakens. Emotional effort becomes one-sided, and because the empath continues understanding everyone's emotional struggles, other people stop feeling urgency to change. The empath's compassion accidentally becomes permission, not intentionally. But psychologically, repeated forgiveness without consequences teaches people that the relationship will survive no matter what happens. And that is where emotional damage becomes extremely deep. At some point, the empath begins noticing a painful imbalance. They realize they are constantly making emotional sacrifices nobody else seems willing to make for them. They notice they are always the one trying harder to preserve the connection. They are always the one calming conflict, the one understanding emotional wounds, the one giving second chances, the one protecting everyone else's feelings while their own emotional needs remain ignored. And little by little, emotional exhaustion begins replacing emotional attachment. This stage is incredibly quiet. The empath does not usually announce it. They do not always express how deeply tired they are becoming. Instead, they internalize it. They carry it silently, which is why many people become shocked later when the empath finally leaves emotionally. They think the relationship was stable because the empath stayed patient for so long, but internally the empath had already been struggling for months or years. Emotional exhaustion had already started disconnecting them from the relationship piece by piece. Many empaths reach a point where they no longer recognize themselves emotionally. They feel constantly drained, constantly anxious, constantly responsible for emotional peace. They become emotionally hyper-aware of everyone else while emotionally disconnected from themselves. Their nervous system stays tense for too long, their emotional needs remain ignored for too long, and eventually they stop feeling emotionally safe inside the relationship they once fought desperately to protect. That is when the emotional shift begins. Not anger, not hatred. Exhaustion, deep emotional exhaustion, the kind that slowly numbs attachment over time. People often assume empaths leave because one final dramatic event happened, but most of the time the final breaking point is much deeper than that. It is not only about pain, it is about realization. The empath suddenly understands that the person hurting them fully understands the damage they are causing and continues anyway. That realization changes everything psychologically, because accidental mistakes feel different than repeated conscious disrespect. Empaths can survive misunderstandings. They can survive emotional flaws. They can survive human imperfection. What destroys them internally is realizing their kindness is no longer being protected. That moment feels deeply personal to an empath because emotional trust matters more to them than almost anything else. Once they emotionally trust someone, they become extremely loyal. They defend that person privately. They support them emotionally. They give endless emotional patience. But if they begin realizing that loyalty is being exploited instead of valued, something inside them starts shutting down, slowly at first, then permanently. This is the emotional line most people never notice crossing. The line where the empath realizes their forgiveness is no longer inspiring change. It is only making the disrespect easier to repeat. That realization cuts deeply because empaths do not give their emotional energy casually. They invest heavily in the people they love. They remember details, emotional moments, vulnerabilities, promises. They care deeply about emotional safety. So when someone repeatedly violates that safety after being forgiven again and again, the empath eventually reaches a painful conclusion. The person understands the pain they are causing. They simply no longer care enough to stop causing it. That understanding changes the entire emotional structure of the relationship. The empath stops seeing mistakes and starts seeing choices. That distinction is devastating emotionally, because once behavior begins feeling intentional instead of accidental, forgiveness becomes much harder for them psychologically. Not because they become cruel, but because emotional trust begins collapsing internally. And once trust starts dying inside an empath, emotional distance slowly follows behind it. One of the clearest signs this emotional shift is happening is silence. The empath stops explaining themselves repeatedly, stops trying to prove their worth emotionally, stops begging to be understood. At first, people misread this silence as emotional calmness. But internally, the empath is emotionally withdrawing, protecting what little emotional energy they still have left. They begin observing more than speaking, feeling numb instead of reactive, quiet instead of expressive. And many people completely fail to recognize how serious this stage is because the empath still appears physically present. But internally, they are already grieving, already disconnecting, already accepting emotionally that the relationship may never become healthy again. There is another painful layer to this process that rarely gets discussed, Empaths often feel guilty for reaching their breaking point. Even after repeated disrespect, part of them still wonders whether leaving makes them selfish. They question themselves until the very end. That is why their emotional shutdown takes so long. They fight internally between self-protection and compassion for the other person. One side of them wants peace. The other side keeps remembering the emotional bond they once shared. And this internal conflict drains them even further. Yet eventually, even the most patient heart reaches exhaustion. The empath realizes they cannot continue sacrificing themselves emotionally just to preserve a connection built on imbalance. They realize love cannot survive where emotional safety no longer exists. And most importantly, they realize understanding someone's pain does not require tolerating endless emotional damage from them. That realization becomes the final emotional boundary. And once it fully settles into the empath's mind, something changes permanently. The warmth becomes quieter. The emotional access becomes smaller. The attachment weakens, not because they stopped caring instantly, but because they cared for too long without feeling emotionally protected in return. The saddest part is that many people only recognize this emotional transformation after it is already too late. They become confused when the empath stops reacting emotionally, stops chasing, stops fighting for the relationship. But what they fail to understand is that the empath already spent months trying internally, already spent endless nights emotionally processing the pain alone, already forgave more than most people ever would have forgiven. And now there is simply nothing left emotionally to give. Because the moment an empath realizes you knew you were hurting them and did it anyway, something changes permanently inside them. The final stage rarely looks dramatic from the outside. There is usually no explosive ending, no emotional scene powerful enough to warn people that the relationship is already collapsing internally. That is why so many people completely miss the moment an empath emotionally leaves. Because unlike people who react immediately to pain, empaths process pain slowly and deeply. Long before they physically distance themselves, they have already spent countless nights mentally replaying conversations, analyzing behavior, questioning themselves, and trying to emotionally repair a connection that keeps damaging them. By the time they finally become quiet, they are already exhausted beyond words. Most people expect heartbreak to look emotional. Crying, arguing, begging, emotional breakdowns. But with empaths, the deepest heartbreak often looks like silence. A silence so calm that people mistake it for peace. But internally, it is emotional surrender. It is the moment they realize they no longer have the strength to keep carrying a relationship alone. One of the first things that changes after the final betrayal is that the empath stops explaining themselves repeatedly. Before reaching this stage, they probably tried many times to communicate their feelings. They tried to clarify misunderstandings. They tried to express emotional pain gently. They tried to stay patient during conversations that drained them emotionally. They kept hoping honesty and vulnerability would finally create understanding. But after enough repeated disappointment, something inside them changes. They realize words are no longer changing anything. The same emotional wounds keep repeating. The same disrespect keeps returning. The same promises keep breaking. And eventually they become emotionally tired of explaining pain to someone who only temporarily listens. That is when silence begins replacing emotional effort. This silence is not emotional emptiness at first. It is protection. The empath starts conserving emotional energy because they no longer feel safe spending it carelessly. Conversations become shorter. Reactions become smaller. They stop defending their feelings with the same intensity. Not because the pain disappeared, but because they finally understand that forcing someone to care emotionally is impossible. And this realization hurts deeply because empaths naturally believe emotional honesty should create emotional connection. When it repeatedly fails to do that, they slowly lose hope inside the relationship. Another major shift is that they stop chasing emotional closeness. This change confuses many people because empaths are usually the emotional initiators in relationships. They check in, they ask questions, they try to reconnect after conflict. They notice emotional distance quickly and instinctively try to repair it. But after the final betrayal, that instinct weakens. They stop running after emotional reciprocity. They stop trying to force emotional intimacy that no longer feels natural. And the reason this shift feels so shocking is because people became emotionally dependent on the empath always being the one who cared more. For a long time, the empath carried the emotional weight of the relationship almost alone. They kept conversations alive, kept emotional connection alive, kept forgiveness alive, but eventually exhaustion reaches a point where their nervous system simply cannot continue operating that way anymore. They become emotionally detached not because they want revenge, but because survival finally becomes more important than attachment. One painful reality about empath detachment is that it often happens while they are still physically present. They may still answer messages, still sit beside you, still continue daily routines, but internally the emotional connection has already started fading away. This is why people later describe empaths as suddenly changing overnight. But the change was never sudden, it was slow, silent, invisible. The empath was emotionally drowning quietly for a very long time before anyone noticed the emotional distance appearing on the surface. When empaths stop fighting for the relationship, that is usually one of the most serious signs emotionally possible. Because empaths fight hardest when they truly care. They invest deeply into emotional repair. They tolerate difficult conversations. They stay during painful phases longer than most people ever would. So when that emotional effort suddenly disappears, it usually means they have already reached emotional exhaustion internally. They no longer believe the relationship can become emotionally safe again. And perhaps the saddest part is that many empaths still love the person while emotionally detaching from them. That contradiction creates enormous emotional pain. Part of them still remembers the connection, still remembers the good moments, still remembers the emotional bond they once protected so carefully. But another part finally understands that love alone cannot heal repeated emotional damage. That understanding breaks something inside them because empaths naturally want emotional harmony. Letting go feels like emotional failure to them at first, yet staying continues destroying them slowly. This is why their detachment becomes quiet instead of dramatic. They stop begging to be understood. Stop trying to prove their emotional value. Stop trying to convince someone to care properly. And eventually they stop expecting emotional safety from the relationship at all. That emotional numbness is often the final stage before they leave completely. The loudest heartbreak is not when they cry. It's when they become emotionally quiet. Because emotional quietness in an empath usually means they already cried privately too many times before anyone noticed. They already carried the pain internally until exhaustion replaced emotional reaction. Many people mistake this stage as emotional coldness. But in reality, it is emotional burnout. The empath is no longer reacting because they no longer believe reacting will change anything. There is also a hidden psychological shift happening during this stage. The empath slowly begins emotionally returning to themselves. For a long time, their focus stayed locked on preserving the relationship, understanding the other person, maintaining peace, preventing emotional conflict. But once emotional detachment begins, they slowly start realizing how much of themselves they abandoned trying to save someone else emotionally. They notice how exhausted they feel constantly, how anxious they became, how emotionally tense they stayed for too long. And this awareness creates another painful realization. They were sacrificing their own emotional stability to protect a relationship that was no longer protecting them back. This realization changes the way they see everything. Not instantly, but permanently. The emotional bond starts weakening because emotional trust has already collapsed internally. And once an empath stops feeling emotionally safe, reconnecting becomes incredibly difficult. Their heart may still care, but their nervous system no longer trusts the environment emotionally. This is also why many people become shocked when empaths finally leave. They underestimated the emotional damage for too long. People grow comfortable receiving endless patience from empaths, comfortable receiving forgiveness after every mistake, comfortable assuming the empath will always understand, always stay calm, always give another chance. Over time, that patience becomes normalized instead of appreciated. The empath's emotional tolerance becomes expected behavior instead of recognized emotional effort. And slowly, people stop realizing how much emotional weight the empath is carrying silently every single day. Patience gets mistaken for weakness. Compassion gets mistaken for emotional dependence. Forgiveness gets mistaken for lack of boundaries. And because empaths rarely react aggressively at the beginning of emotional pain, people assume the damage is not serious. They assume the empath will continue tolerating everything forever. But emotional pain does not disappear simply because someone handles it quietly. In fact, quiet pain often becomes the deepest kind because nobody notices it building until the relationship is already collapsing internally. One reason people underestimate empath boundaries is because empaths usually communicate their pain gently instead of aggressively. They do not always demand attention loudly. They hint at emotional hurt softly. They try to preserve peace even during difficult conversations. But unfortunately, many people only take emotional pain seriously when it becomes loud. And because the empath stays calm for so long, their suffering gets minimized repeatedly. That repeated emotional minimization slowly destroys trust. The empath begins feeling emotionally invisible, emotionally unheard, emotionally unsupported, and eventually they stop believing their vulnerability is emotionally safe inside the relationship. This is why the final goodbye often shocks people deeply. They remember all the times the empath forgave before, all the times they stayed patient before, all the times they returned emotionally after conflict before. So they assume this time will end the same way too. But what they fail to understand is that the empath was slowly reaching emotional exhaustion during every previous forgiveness. Every betrayal weakened trust further. Every dismissal weakened emotional safety further. Every repeated wound slowly drained the emotional connection until finally there was nothing left strong enough to hold the relationship together internally. Many people only realize the true emotional value of an empath after the connection disappears completely, after the emotional warmth is gone, after the emotional support disappears, after the patience disappears, after the quiet loyalty they depended on is no longer there anymore. Only then do they begin recognizing how much emotional stability the empath brought into their life. But by that stage, the empath is often emotionally too far gone to reconnect the same way again. Not because they became cruel, not because they stopped caring completely, but because their emotional trust died slowly over time. And once trust dies inside an empath, rebuilding it becomes incredibly difficult. Because empaths do not fear pain as much as they fear emotional betrayal. Pain can heal, mistakes can heal, but repeated betrayal after repeated forgiveness changes the way they emotionally experience the relationship forever. That is the part most people never understand. The empath did not suddenly become distant one day for no reason. They became distant after carrying emotional disappointment silently for too long. They became quiet after explaining their pain too many times without lasting change. They became emotionally detached after realizing their kindness was no longer emotionally safe in the hands of the person they trusted most. So no, the empath didn't leave because they stopped caring. They left because caring started destroying them. Every extra chance cost them emotional energy. Every ignored feeling weakened emotional trust. Every repeated betrayal slowly convinced them that love alone could not protect the relationship anymore. And eventually they reached a painful emotional truth they could no longer ignore. Understanding someone's pain does not require sacrificing yourself endlessly to it. Empaths forgive deeply, far deeper than most people realize. They forgive things quietly that would already make others walk away immediately. They absorb emotional pain privately. They keep hoping for change long after hope should have ended. But once trust dies, something inside them closes forever. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. And that quietness is often the final proof that the empath already loved harder, stayed longer, forgave deeper, and emotionally endured far more than anyone around them ever truly understood. If this felt personal, it's because many people silently carry this kind of emotional weight every single day. Some people spend years forgiving pain they never deserved, hoping love, patience, and understanding will eventually heal what keeps breaking them inside. And sometimes the strongest people are not the loudest ones in the room, but the quiet ones still trying to love without losing themselves completely. So if parts of this video connected deeply with you, just know this: you are not alone in feeling this way. There are people all over the world fighting the same silent emotional battles, learning the hard way that kindness should never require self-destruction. And maybe the biggest lesson in all of this is that empaths do not disappear because they stop caring. They disappear because they cared for too long without feeling safe enough to keep giving pieces of themselves away. That quiet emotional shutdown people call coldness is often just exhaustion hidden behind silence. A heart can only survive so much betrayal before it finally chooses peace over attachment. If you want more deep psychological insights about empathy, human behavior, emotional intelligence, silent manipulation, and the hidden patterns most people never notice, subscribe to the channel and become part of this community. These videos are for the people who feel deeply, think deeply, and quietly carry emotions most others never see. And if this video spoke to something you've experienced personally, take 1 second to like the video. It helps this message reach more people who may need to hear it right now. And share this with someone who keeps forgiving until there is nothing left inside them to give. Someone who always understands others, but rarely feels understood themselves. Until next time, protect your peace, protect your energy, and never forget this truth. The kindest hearts often hide the deepest scars.